Welcome to Intro to Luke. In today's video, we're in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11, in which we have two stories that continue the confrontation between Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees that began at the end of chapter 5. Now, these two stories serve a literary purpose. They occur, according to Luke's gospel, early on in the Galilean ministry, and yet they foreshadow the murder of Jesus in Passion Week, at the end of the gospel. So they're very important, especially verse 11, which if you have your gospel, your Bible, let's turn to the gospel in chapter 6, verses 1 through 11, and I'll begin now. On a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but priests to eat. And also he gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now verse 6 says that on another Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a way, a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. In verse 9, Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them all, he said to him, the man with the withered hand, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. Verse 11, but they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. The word of the Lord. These two stories are really part of three that takes us back to the last story in chapter 5. They all go hand in glove. The one in chapter 5 dealt with fasting. So all three of these stories deal with something about either the law or the traditions of the elders. And Jesus is trying to correct their thinking on the law and even on these traditions. But as you saw from verse 11, it doesn't really go too well, does it? No. So let's look at the first story here in chapter 6. And what's very interesting about it is that Luke is continuing his theme of Jesus being the perfect Israelite. What does it say here? It says in verse 1 that it was Jesus' disciples who were plucking and eating the grain, rubbing it between their hands, and it's on a Sabbath day, which of course upset the Pharisees. So Luke carefully keeps Jesus out of the action that is under question. So what it does is it forces the Pharisees to criticize really the disciples, but they're really talking to Jesus. So they're implying that Jesus was not a righteous teacher, because if he was, Jesus would have been the first to yell at these recalcitrant disciples who are violating the Sabbath. You see, with these Pharisees, there was no gray area here. It is not lawful to do this on the Sabbath. No exceptions. Well, in my mind, I see this exasperated Jesus who says, "Have you not read?" And then he tells them the story, a story they know well, about David who's fleeing for his life from King Saul. And he eats the bread of the presence, which of course, as Jesus points out, it's not lawful for anyone to do. So you would think then that the Bible would record what a horrible sinner David was in doing this, and he even gave it to his men. But no, it never says anything like that. The Bible's very good at rehearsing David's sin. I mean, consider the adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah the Hittite, for crying out loud. The Bible's very clear about that. Yet here, in David's case, his life is being threatened, and that overcame this law that prevented him from eating the bread of the presence. This is very important. Once we get this in our mind, then what Jesus says in his exasperated fashion, have you not read? Isn't it obvious is basically what he's saying here. And that becomes really, from the Lord of glory, a bit of a subtle warning, a shot across the bow, if you will, to these Pharisees who claim to know the Scriptures and to love them, when in reality, that's not so clear, is it? Maybe they don't get it. Or, as we'll soon see in the second story, there's more going on here than meets the eye. But let's look at verse 5, because Jesus really issues a coup de grace. Look at it. He says to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, I don't know about you, but as soon as I read that, I'm expecting those first century people to hear that and to realize the breathtaking scope of such a statement that they would just explode. And yet, the silence here is deafening. It really is. I mean, I fully expect these Pharisees to pick up any stone lying near them and to cast it at Jesus, but they don't. At least not in accordance with Luke's gospel. And so that's very, very interesting. And I really do think it would be silly to think that such a statement wouldn't upset them. They would immediately associate it with divinity, because only God is Lord of the Sabbath, right? So I think more than likely that what's happening here from a literary standpoint is that Luke is trying to build tension. So then, knowing the stories, we can see how in verse 11, they do explode. They were filled with fury, explosion, okay? Verse 11 is where the explosion occurs. And so don't let it bother you that there's nothing of a response on their part, because Luke is putting these stories together, and you have to read them in tandem to really understand where Luke's going with his story. So let's move on to the second story, shall we? And this one's very interesting because it quickly, it's got Jesus in a synagogue on the Sabbath, so he's not wandering about in the fields, and it tells us the man is there with the withered hand, of course. And what's interesting is that verse 8 says that Jesus knows their thoughts, and he's referring back to the scribes and Pharisees. In other words, and the reason I'm jumping quickly to 8 is because, to me, it ties back to verse 5. In other words, Jesus saying the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath is a declaration of his divinity. And then in verse 8, we see that Jesus knew their thoughts, and those are basically saying the same thing, because only God is Lord of the Sabbath, and only God is intimately aware of man's thoughts and knows intimately his heart. And so these are both declarations of his divinity by Luke. So the backstory then is verse 7, which says that the scribes and Pharisees, they're watching Jesus, and they want to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might find a reason to accuse him. So they've come on this day with malice aforethought to try to really be able to accuse Jesus, drag him before the Sanhedrin or something. So they have malice aforethought, and Jesus knows that. And then, of course, what does he do? He brings the man with the withered hand forward. And in verse 9, he asks them the question. This is the question. I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? Now, this leads us to verse 10, which you have to kind of pause and read it from a literary standpoint. What is he saying here? And after looking around at them all, he said to the man with the hand, stretch out your hand and it's healed, right? What I want you to see is that what's really interesting is that nobody responds to the question in verse 9. They don't respond. And so the sense here is almost like Jesus taking his time, being patient, looking at them, and in a sense being saddened by the hardness, the callous nature of their hearts. And he knew it well, better than any man. He knew what was inside of a man because he's divine. And so that's very telling in the story, is that he takes his time and he gives them a moment to answer, and none answer. And so, of course, he heals the man. He heals the man with the withered hand. Now, I think that this giving them time, where he looks around and he asks them the question, that it really does go back to the question back up in verse 3, have you not read? They really do tie in together, because he is really trying to give them pause and let them think about what they're doing and what their real agenda is. But, of course, what they're seeing is not so much that a man is being healed on the Sabbath day. Honestly, I don't think they really cared one way or the other. Not really. Rather, they were seriously opposed to Jesus taking their authority and control over the people. Remember, one of the great themes of Luke is this kingdoms in conflict deal, where Jesus is bringing a divine kingdom, a new kind of kingdom. And the Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, chief priests, all of these people align themselves together against Jesus. They represent the kingdom of man, earthly kingdoms. And so what's going on here, at some level, is this conflict that's going on between the divine kingdom of God and the earthly kingdom of man. And so what I want you to see here is that in verse 11, we really get to a literary crescendo in this symphony, so to speak. And verse 11 is where the cymbals crash. And it's just so dramatic that after healing a man on the Lord's day, they are filled with fury. This is the picture of a murderous rage, that if they could rip him limb from limb, they would have done so. This overreaction to a great miracle speaks to us about the state of the heart and its hardness of national Israel, or certainly the leadership. and why they could find it within their hearts to murder this man who did nothing but good. How sad. How sad. And so I can't help but reflect on the nature of the question where he said, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? That is the most simple of questions. So it almost is a no-brainer, let's just say it that way, because obviously it is better to do good on the Sabbath than anything else. It's an obvious, simple answer. And yet, they are like Adam, who could have eaten from every tree in the garden, and God said, don't eat from that one tree. They're kind of like Adam, and they want to eat from the one tree. You know, man's heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? And so on that somber note, I'll see you next time.